Jason Vesper, Friends and Allies. Jason Vesper was a truly remarkable man, even before he became a vampire. But obviously, even he could not cope with the dangers of the Alpha Omniverse on his own, and over the centuries was aided by many companions, organisations, friends, and creatures from across the multiverse in his battles against evil. Not all of his travelling companions are known for sure, as he spent many centuries in other realities, but these are the companions it is known he worked with for the longest periods, and who seemingly had the most profound impact on his life. His first known travelling companion was Joy from the Road universe, who joined him shortly before his journey to the Stars universe. Jason, throughout the first 100 years or so, was more interested in simply exploring, which prevented him from getting into as much trouble. But as soon as he started to interfere, it became obvious to the vampire that he needed help. Joy was perhaps an unconventional first choice for companion, as she came from a primitive, barbaric world of dinosaurs. But, as we have explored in some ways, though he wouldn't admit it, Jason was missing his daughter, and Joy's strong, forthright nature reminded him of her before Mona damned herself. Whilst the famous Void agent Jemima Solomon may have aided Jason and Joy when they first arrived on the star's Earth to deal with the dinosaur crisis, during his original 10 years, he and Jemima very rarely worked together, as she dealt with primarily local threats. She was not normally part of their interdimensional team and had only been called in for the dinosaur situation due to their normal team having been slaughtered on the first day by the savage reptiles. Jason instead worked very closely with Captain Annette Robertson from Scotland. Born in the year 1922, Annette had been among the first soldiers recruited during the Yenkers' war against the Talanav in the 50s, and had even been a celebrated war hero, though she was now determined to make up for her support of the Yenker, who she could see were in many ways monsters in their own right. Many in Void had trouble working with Annette due to her past with the Yenker. But fortunately, Jason understood why she was taken in, having also come from a seemingly perfect society, only to see its corruption rip it apart, with the two forming a strong bond. In fact, Annette was the first person Jason experienced romantic feelings for after his wife. But sadly, the guilt of moving on, along with Annette having also lost her lover during the war, meant that the two were never able to begin a proper relationship, something both later came to regret. Still, they always remained close allies. During his first 5 years on Earth, Jason would also take on another companion, a young man named Matthew Tyler, who had been a former police officer before the crisis. Born in 1940, Matthew came from a somewhat more privileged background. His relationship with his parents had always been extremely difficult, as his somewhat more sensitive, shy nature led to Matthew being the black sheep of the family, compared to his brother, who followed in his father's footsteps as an engineer. Matthew, in many respects, was pushed into being a policeman by his grandfather, who was about the only member of the family who showed him kindness. Matthew felt he owed it to his grandfather, and at the same time wanted to show his parents that he wasn't too soft either. His career went well at first, before the crisis, as the alien advancement of human society meant that there was very little crime. But after the dimensional rip, as society broke down, the police struggled to keep a lid on the riots and criminals, supernatural and otherwise, running rampant. It wasn't actually the scum he fought on the streets that eventually made Matthew quit, but rather the corruption in the force itself. The police, after the crisis in many societies around the world, were forced to work with and recruit more unsavoury characters, again supernatural or otherwise, to deal with the anarchy on the streets and the catastrophic loss in their own numbers. According to Matthew, in time the lines between the cops and the thugs they used to throw in jail became interchangeable, and he eventually quit when his new captain was replaced by a vampire named Seth, who used the police force to cover up and acquire new victims. Matthew suffered a mental breakdown after quitting his job in 1971, which caused his ailing parents to further disown him. They both passed away not long after. Eventually, the vampire captain that had driven him out took over Matthew's entire hometown. People were afraid to walk the streets at night, with Matthew only being spared due to the vampire's desire to torture him by showing the former officers the extent of his failures. Seth's arrogance, however, proved to be his downfall, as, when a portal opened up in the area, he tried to take control of its strange properties, which led to the town almost being pulled into another universe. In the end, with Jason and Joy's help, Matthew was able to defeat his vampiric nemesis and ensure that only Seth was pulled in instead. Though, sadly, this wasn't the end of Seth, who would return from the other universe as a much more dangerous figure than ever before and continue to plague Jason for decades to come. After Seth's defeat, Jason welcomed Matthew on board the balloon. He got on better with Jason at first than Joy had with Jason in the early days, as Matthew was more willing to follow the vampire's orders. Still, in spite of this, Matthew's closest bond was with Joy, as the two slowly fell in love and, after 5 years, eventually left Jason to get married and embark on their own adventures on Earth. Jason wasn't bitter. In fact, he eventually became the godfather to their daughter, who, decades later, went on adventures with Jason himself, much to her parents' chagrin. His next most prominent companion during his original stay on Earth after Joy and Matthew was the former vampire resistance fighter, Renee O'Cooper. She came from an alternative version of the Earth, where vampires waged an open war against humanity, beginning in the year 2003. She was born in the year 2008 and spent her entire early life fighting the bloodsuckers. Luckily for her, one of the portals pulled Renee into the Star's universe in the year 2033 from her world, though only 1974 in the Star's reality, before the vampires finally destroyed her planet. She wandered the streets dazed, confused, and injured from the hectic transfer until she was found by a young 20-something woman named Sophia, who was an agent of Void. Sophia took Renee in and looked after her. The two soon began a relationship, and Renee was happy for the first time in her life. But it wasn't to last, as Sophia was later killed in 1977 during the Jarvensia invasion. Renee became a wreck for years afterwards and only began to pull her life back together in 1979 when she joined Jason on his travels. Her journeys with Jason helped to open her mind somewhat, as she saw many more versions of her world where things worked out for her and her people, which at least gave Renee hope that no matter what horrors happened here, somewhere in the multiverse, good would prevail and the people she loved would be happy. She eventually left Jason in 1982 after falling in love with the dedicated vampire hunter Tom Griffith. Jason's final companion during his stay on Earth was Carleen, another reformed vampire, albeit one from a very different universe. He first met her a few months after her resurrection. Carleen actually came from our reality and had been turned into a vampire in the 1960s of our Earth. She had been a singer in life and was turned by a deranged fan who wanted to make her his bride. After killing him, Carleen vowed to control her thirst, partly because she knew even when under the curse of vampirism that it was the right thing to do, and also partly because she didn't want to let her maker, who had stalked her in life, turn her into a monster. Carleen also used her powers to actively fight the forces of darkness and became a legendary hero, eventually joining the Circus family, a group of reformed demons, witches, and aliens who travelled through time and space in a magic circus, battling evil. Whilst many members of the Circus family came and went, Carleen remained for centuries before a battle with a supernatural power blasted her forwards in time past the end of her universe's history and into the Star's universe that will form from our reality's ruins. The power catapulting Carleen will eventually burn out in the year 1982 of the Star's Earth, trapping her here. This wasn't the first time that Carleen had been thrown through time. Leaving aside her journeys with the family, she had been thrown through time on her own Earth from the year 2007 to the 19th century, where she remained trapped for many years before joining the family. The after effects of this journey and her later travels altered her body somewhat to the point where she was more vulnerable to time, anomalies, and disturbances. This was a double-edged sword for Carleen, as, whilst it made her more susceptible to being consumed by time holes and anomalies, she also could sense disturbances in the vortex, and when history needed to go on a certain path for the greater good. She even got visions of the future at certain points. Carleen knew from the start that she had obviously arrived on an alternate Earth, but it wasn't until she and Jason met that she learned just how far from home she was. She was not scared. Much like Jason, she relished the chance to explore another plane of existence, having seen so much of her reality, and eagerly joined him on his travels. They would spend many decades together in other realities, though in the Star's universe only 7 years passed. She and Jason were an extremely effective team, As, on the one hand, she was far more experienced, having been travelling with the circus family for thousands of years at this point, whilst, at the same time, Jason obviously knew more about the Alpha Omniverse than she did. Also, whilst both vampires, Carleen belonged to a very different breed to Jason, and their powers and abilities helped complement each other at different points. Jason and Carleen eventually fell in love. He still felt guilty after centuries of moving on, whilst Carleen herself had lost many people close to her too. But ultimately, both couldn't deny their feelings, and the fact that in many ways, for the first time, they didn't have to worry about their partner, and the fact that one of them would grow old and die pulled them closer together in a way that never could have been with anyone else. At one point, Jason even contemplated settling down with her on the star's Earth. But the two's relationship was not to last, as when dealing with one interdimensional crisis on the star's Earth in the year 1992, she had foreseen in a vision that a great evil from another reality would enter this world in the year 1997, and that she had to train a group of warriors to stop it. According to her vision, only she could stop it. All other timelines would fail, and Jason was still needed for other great tasks on other worlds, according to the vision. It was one of the hardest things either ever had to do, but they knew they had to separate for the greater good. After defeating the invaders in the late 90s and facing other threats, Carleen would join the new version of the circus family from this universe in 2002 and spend many more centuries travelling with them. She and Jason would reunite and work together just once more. But by that point, too much time had passed and both were on different paths for them to reconcile. They always looked back at their time together as one of the happiest in their lives, however. Not long after leaving Carleen, Jason would have his second resurrection, and in his third form, he finally reunited with his daughter Mona. The two had worked together again during the 70s, but that meeting did little to repair their damaged relationship. Finally, in the 90s, from the Star's universe perspective, the two reconciled when Jason's own people caught up with him and sentenced the vampire to death. It was not for his earlier desertion, however. Rather, it was because his actions across the multiverse had made many powerful enemies, including the Jarventia, who launched a devastating attack on Jason's home universe as a form of revenge. Whilst Jason had ultimately saved his people from these monsters, they blamed him for bringing their reality to their attention. With Mona, who had seen how he had saved his universe, appalled at the injustice of it all, to the point where she saved him and went on the run with her father. Things didn't go smoothly for the vampire and his daughter at first, and they were further complicated by the arrival of Martera, a former servant of the Jarventia, who Mona invited to live on the balloon, believing he could change. In time, Mona and Matera would fall in love, and whilst Jason warmed to them, he never fully trusted Matera. Though, when the latter gave his life to protect both Jason and Mona from the synth arch, the vampire felt he had misjudged him and harboured guilt about it for the rest of his life. Still, by the time Mona left him at the start of the 2000s, she and Jason had fully reconciled, with Mona only leaving him to help another alternate version of the Earth she had grown fond of. Jason continued to visit her and her adopted daughter for many more years to come, with the two also reuniting against the Jarventia in 2010. Following this, Jason, who was now in his fourth body, would take on Joy and Matthew's daughter Vicky, who was one of the most enthusiastic companions at first, having heard stories from her parents. She actually stowed away on board the balloon in 2001, being able to enter it as her parents had been given free access all the time by Jason, and the similarity of her DNA to theirs confused the balloon enough to allow access. She left a message for her parents to let them know what was happening, but by the time they got it, Jason was unknowingly halfway across the multiverse. He was utterly appalled to find her there and instantly tried to take her back. But sadly, his ship got lost along the way, and they were forced to spend a few years together. Vicky's enthusiasm for adventure was soon diminished when she saw up close the horrors that Jason faced on his adventures. But she and the vampire nevertheless did develop a strong bond. As time went on, she did become stronger and more capable, and even saved the vampire on more than one occasion. She also met her husband on her adventures with Jason. He was called Cyclov and came from a more advanced version of this Earth. Cyclov and Vicky, after being returned to her dimension in 2003, would be able to cross over to his and back to theirs thanks to a device left over by Jason whenever they wanted. Other than some arguments about which universe they were going to spend Christmas in, their relationship was a happy one. After Vicky, Jason, who had moved on to his fifth body during his time with her, would travel with another young girl named Holly, who came from a version of Earth that had been invaded by aliens known as the Vanderica in the mid-20th century. By the time of Holly's birth, in the year 2039, the humans of this reality were completely subjugated. Their only purpose in life was to serve their alien masters, though there were still pecking orders within humanity. The aliens still controlled every aspect of their lives, from the houses they lived in, what they ate, who their partners would be, how many children they were allowed, assuming they were allowed any, even what their hobbies and interests were. The aliens made sure that the right humans would be guided in every way possible, i.e., the strongest would take up weightlifting. Those who were artistically inclined and talented would be given roles in entertainment to ensure that the public would be properly entertained and live in comfort. Whilst there were resistance groups for decades, by the time Jason arrived, they had become completely complacent with the official narrative being that the aliens had improved their life on Earth and brought order to chaos. In all fairness, the Vanderica, in their own way, did care about humanity. They were not evil like the Jarventia. They believed they were bringing order to lesser races and stopping them from going through the same bloodshed and chaos they had. There were no wars under their rule until the end, and all diseases were cured. But sadly, the aliens did still exploit humanity and other planets they conquered across the universe, though they were always able to justify it as being for the greater good of the galaxy. Jason, in his attempt to free the humans, was quickly betrayed by them and captured by the Vanderica. Unlike most of her kind by that stage, Holly possessed a tiny grain of independent thought and subsequently helped Jason escape. It was her way of repaying him for saving her from a disaster. Jason had first arrived in this universe in the middle of a battle between the Vanderica and their enemies. Holly and her family had been abandoned by the Vanderica for the greater good, and whilst she was initially willing to die for them, in those last few seconds as she held her wife, the true reality of her death and her life as nothing more than a tool for these invaders who didn't truly care for her sunk in, and she saw Jason as a true hero compared to them. After freeing Jason, Holly, the first human to betray the Vanderica in over 100 years, became the most wanted criminal on Earth. Even her own wife turned against her, and so Holly had no choice but to go with Jason, who gave up on trying to help this world. Holly wasn't used to thinking for herself, and at first was a little bit too reliant on Jason, who ironically missed Joy's constant questioning of him. Still, in time, Holly became a strong-willed woman who, in some ways, had a harder time than many of Jason's other companions, as she had to hold back his fifth, more ruthless and vicious incarnation and help him recover. Tragically, in the years Holly was away with Jason, her world was destroyed. A renegade group of the Vanderica, known as the Hyverian, completely destroyed the Vanderica's empire and took a particular pleasure in eradicating the Earth that had been the Vanderica's favourite planet. Jason and Holly did eventually discover the last surviving colony of humans who had managed to escape to an uninhabited planet, and she ultimately decided to stay there to help them, though Jason would check in on her many times, and she did help them to flourish and even married again to a woman named Lara, who she settled down with. The Vanderica would go on to face Jason many more times. Near the end of his fifth life, and for most of his sixth, Jason would travel with two people, Christine Bullock and David Anderson. Christine came from another universe and was an interdimensional traveller like Jason. Her ship, sent by her people, however, had become trapped in a hostile dimension which began to twist and mutate her crew into horrifying monsters. Christine was the ship's nurse and did all she could to help them and herself. But sadly, by the time Jason arrived, it was too late for all of the others, and he was forced to destroy them before they returned to their home universe to wreak havoc, though one survived. Christine, meanwhile, joined Jason and finally lived out her lifelong dream to see the multiverse. She was much older than most of his other companions and was in her late 40s when she joined Jason. David, meanwhile, in contrast, was the vampire's youngest companion. He was only 17. His parents had been killed by a particularly vicious coven of witches and warlocks who kept David, along with several others, including his sister, alive as slaves for 2 years. His sister, sadly, did not survive. After Jason destroyed the coven, he took the young boy on as a companion. Jason and Christine became parental figures to the boy, though they were not in a relationship with each other. David soon proved himself, and by the end of his 5 years of travelling the multiverse with Jason, David had become a very capable and powerful warrior in his own right. Christine would eventually leave Jason to return to and help her people, when the rip her initial doomed vessel created caused more of the same energy that had corrupted her shipmates to flood her galaxy and infect millions more. David would stay on for a shorter while longer until he found purpose again in the Mesmera reality, where an alternate version of his sister had taken over the coven that captured them both and had become corrupted, as David had died in this reality instead. David hoped he could redeem her, and he was able to get through to the good side of his sister, who later became a great hero and ally of Jason, though she never became his companion. Following the departure of David, Jason would next travel with the immortal Alicia Washington for the end of his 6th life and the start of his 7th and final life. Alicia came from a version of the Earth that effectively died and whose people tried to escape using interdimensional technology to an alternate Earth, one that was running several million years behind and was still during the age of the dinosaurs. A group of settlers from Wash's world were able to establish a colony on this prehistoric Earth dubbed Terra Nova. Wash became an enforcer of Terra Nova, but was killed when Terra Nova went rogue from the government from Alicia's world. The people of Terra Nova did not want the government corrupting and destroying this prehistoric Earth like they had their own, and a battle soon took place where Wash was shot in the head. The people of Terra Nova won the conflict, with Wash being buried in their village afterwards. However, the government back in Wash's world didn't give up and attempted to use the interdimensional technology to travel to another reality. In doing so, they created a similar rip to the one on the star's Earth, though not as severe, that simply splintered, leading to multiple portals to other universes. Terra Nova was hit by one such portal, though it only sustained minimal damage and continued to thrive. Wash's grave, however, that was on the edge of Terra Nova, was ripped from the ground and sent into a nothingness beyond realities by the rip, alongside a large section of the jungle and the dinosaurs in it, where it became trapped for years before being spat out into another reality. Her time in the nothingness between worlds saw Wash's corpse infected with all manners of strange energies from other universes that not only revived but altered her body, gifting her with immortality and advanced healing powers before she arrived in the new reality. In this new world, Wash was forced to survive on her own. While she would not age, she could still die if there was too much damage to her body to heal in time. The dinosaurs, meanwhile, who had been brought with their jungle and altered to be stronger and larger, though they did not gain healing powers as it did not affect them in the same way as a human, thrived in this world and spread out. Over the next several years, the rips would cause others to travel to this world, including a facility from Wash's own version of Earth, as well as people from other alternative Earths, before the rips naturally sealed themselves. Wash would help many of these scattered humans survive the dangers of this world, which included not just the dinosaurs, but other strange creatures both from this world and other realities. Eventually, Wash was able to use the facility from her own world to open another temporary rip, with nothing for her back on her own world, and time having passed to such an extent on Terra Nova that everyone she cared for there had passed on. Wash went on with a young man named Jerome and his lover Ira back to his world. Ira's planet was similarly a dead world. Jerome came from the 1990s on his planet, and when Wash arrived there it felt like an Eden compared to the world she had grown up in. She remained close with Jerome and Ira, but sadly, as they aged and moved on and had children, Wash felt left behind as she was forced to conceal herself to prevent anyone noticing her lack of aging. Jason would arrive on her world in the 2020s to deal with a crisis, and impressed by her knowledge of interdimensional technology, he offered her a place aboard the balloon, which she readily agreed to. Alicia spent many years travelling with Jason, during which time he fell in love with her. It had been many decades from his perspective since he and Carlene had parted company, despite it only being a few years on the star's Earth. Both knew when they parted that they would never be able to reconcile, but still Jason had waited for her all this time, until finally he was ready to move on. Much like Carlene, the fact that Alicia was an immortal meant that Jason was more willing to open up his heart to her, and she to him. Their relationship lasted for decades, with Jason undergoing his final resurrection during this time. Their relationship was to end in tragedy on a return visit to the Star's universe in 2007, when they faced Jason's arch nemesis, the Jarventia. Alicia sacrificed herself to save Jason and was ripped apart by the Jarventia's new weapon. Jason was so devastated by her death that he fled to another reality where he remained in isolation for decades. Alicia was later restored to life by the very creatures whose energy the Jarventia had used to destroy her, through a tiny fragment of her soul that had, against all the odds, survived. They did not reunite her with Jason, however, and instead sent Alicia back to her own universe to help it during a dark time, with Alicia's actions ultimately helping her version of Earth survive. Jason tragically never knew and continued to mourn her. Jason was convinced to return on his travels. During this time, he picked up what was to be his final companion, a 30-something woman from 2008 in the Stars universe, named Misha. She came from Manchester to Jamaican parents. She was very close with her family and had aspirations of being a writer, and even enjoyed some limited success before tragedy struck. In 2007, during the Jarventia's attack, the same one that led to Alicia's death, Misha's entire family were among the hundreds of thousands killed. She was left utterly broken and fell into a depression that lasted for a year, until Jason returned to deal with leftover magics of the Jarventia that were creating mutants. Misha got caught up in the ordeal due to the magics being near where her family had been killed. She had moved to the area out of guilt for not being there for them on that fateful day. Helping to defeat the same kind of evil that had taken her family away inspired Misha to join Jason, and, sympathizing with her desire to make the Jarventia pay, he let her join him on his quest. Misha fell in love with Jason over the course of their adventures, and whilst he did have feelings for her, he did not act on them due to his grief for Alicia and because of her mortality. The two's relationship was further strained when Misha learned the truth that Jason had partly been responsible for the Jarventia's attack on London and cost her family their lives. In his attempt to stop their weapon, he ended up bringing them to the Earth. Misha was furious that Jason had kept this from her and temporarily left him. But in time she came to see that if Jason had not acted, then the monsters would have destroyed everything regardless, and she rejoined him, with the two's relationship becoming even closer than ever before. Jason's adventures came to an end in 2010 following a final battle with the Jarventia, which saw him sacrifice the balloon to destroy the monster's forces for good. Whilst he could have in all probability rebuilt the balloon, Jason, for once, after the devastation on the Star's version of the Earth, felt he needed to stay behind and help the planet recover. During that time, he fought many more horrors brought to the Earth in the aftermath of the Jarventia attack. But it was his oldest enemies, the Veshian Horde, that stripped him of his vampirism. These monsters had copied the exact same process that had tamed vampirism back on Jason's world in order to brainwash several vampires and demons into being their servants over the years. This small, desperate group, the last of the Veshians in fact, simply wanted revenge on Jason, and so they modified the treatment to the point where it was actually able to strip Jason of his vampirism and make him human. The Veshians believed this would be the worst punishment to rob him of his immortality and super strength, and in many ways it was. At first, every normal ache and pain from a human body that he wasn't used to anymore after centuries felt like the worst pain. Still, even in his human body, with Misha's help, he was able to destroy the last of the Veshian, who had planned as a further part of their revenge to turn Jason's modified vampirism into a bomb that would infect humanity, turning them into savage, bestial vampire creatures, though Jason would not be infected. In the final conflict, Jason's vampirism was destroyed in order to defeat the creatures, leaving him both trapped on the Star's version of the Earth and as a human from then on. He finally accepted his fate and remained on the Star's version of Earth for the rest of his life and settled down with Misha. Now that he was mortal, he could admit his feelings for her, and the two eventually married in 2016. It took Jason a long while to adjust to being human again. He actually shut himself off in fear for a long while, but with Misha's support, he was able to find a purpose and continue to serve as an advisor to Void, helping people. In 2017, Misha would give birth to their only son, named after his old companion David, who later followed in his father's footsteps and became the leader of a later incarnation of the circus family, though that is a story for another time. Jason passed away in 2057, with Misha passing away a few years after in 2059. Jason's exploits were never known to the general public. In spite of the presence of the interdimensional anomalies, the supernatural elements were covered up and they were simply written off as aliens and would remain so for another 100 years after Jason's death. Still, his funeral would be attended by beings from all over time and space that he had saved on his travels, who wanted to pay their respects to one of the greatest heroes of the entire omniverse. Even back in his home dimension, several centuries after his death, Jason would be remembered as a pioneer, though his legacy was always more complicated in the seventh universe. In many ways, they were right to view him this way. And whilst Jason did many great things, his arrogance had also led to catastrophe for them and other worlds. Still, there is no denying that had he not chosen to explore the multiverse, then it may not have survived. His battles against the Jarventia alone, never mind all the other horrors he faced, saved all of creation many times over. He deserves his place as a hero, albeit a flawed one.